Hey there, and welcome to the Girl Means Business podcast, the show where we're all about helping you feel confident both as a mom and a business owner. I'm your host, Kendra Swalls, mom of two, former teacher, and full-time photographer and business coach. Each week, we'll discuss the challenges, success, and secrets that make you say, I can do this, because you absolutely can. So pop in those earbuds, grab your favorite snack, and let's get ready, because this girl means business. Oh my goodness, I'm back. I am back. The podcast is back. I'm so excited to be here recording this episode. It's really funny. I've been planning this episode to record today, and I've been doing some other recordings that we'll talk about in a minute, but all day I've had that song in my head from Eminem where it's like, guess who's back? Back again. I'm not going to sing anymore because I don't want to hurt your ears, but that song has been in my head like all day long. And I was like, I'm so excited to be back. And it sounds really strange to say this, but like I've missed you guys. Like I've missed talking to you. And I realize that as a podcast, that seems strange because I'm currently sitting in my office, just me and my dog and a microphone. But it does feel like a conversation with a friend. And I fully trust that you're on the other side of this, acting like you're having a conversation with me as your friend. Maybe sometimes you even talk back to me whenever I say something really dumb or that maybe you don't want to hear. But either way, it has felt like a friendship. And these last couple of months, taking a break from the podcast have felt a little like I was missing a friend. And so I'm back and I'm excited to share with you in this kind of restart, this relaunch episode, a little bit about what's been going on in the last couple of months in my business, in my life, what to expect going forward from the podcast. There are some changes that we'll talk about. They're all good changes, hopefully, and just kind of what is to come. So let's get into it. For starters, you've probably already noticed we have a new intro. We have new music. We have a new intro. When I was thinking about relaunching the podcast, I was like, I want it to feel fresh. I want it to feel new and updated. I have had the same music. I've had the same music for my intro since I started the podcast. I mean, minus like maybe the first handful of episodes, but for the last several years, it's been the same music and it was nice, but I was like, I want something that feels a little more like what I feel like my business and who I have evolved to feels like. And I wanted something a little more upbeat and exciting and that like makes you want to dance in your seat a little bit. And I'm picturing like someone out on a walk and they turn the podcast on and they just kind of add a little extra like hop to their step. And that's what I wanted it to feel like. And so I went through and I listened to some music options and I found one that literally made me dance in my chair as I was listening to it. And I was like, yep, that's the one. And as I was recording the intro, I was dancing to the music before I started going, and it gets my energy up. And that's what I wanted. I wanted you to turn on this episode each week and feel the energy vibe coming through. I wanted you to feel the energy, like really getting you excited about your business, about learning something new, about listening to this podcast, all the things. And so when I was going through the music options, that was definitely one that like it hit. It was like, this is the one. And then the intro, I wanted to update that a little bit. I wanted to kind of clean it up and just make it really quick. I don't even know how many of you listen to the intro each time. Some of you may just skip through that and get right to like the meat of the content, which is totally fine. But I did want something that conveyed a little more of what this podcast is and who it's for. So that's all been updated. We also have a new cover art image. So I did some headshots recently, some marketing photos, and I typically, many of you can probably relate to this, I don't always love being in front of the camera, and I don't always love my photos, but I fell in love with some of the photos that we took at this one photo shoot. And so I was like, yep, as soon as I saw that photo, I was like, this is going to be the new photo for the podcast cover. And if you follow me on social media over at Girl Means Business on Instagram, you saw and you probably got to participate in the cover art voting. There were 6 different original cover art options. It was voted on and almost unanimously, I think it was like ultimately like 87% of you selected that cover image. And throughout the entire voting process, like that was the one photo that everybody could agree on that they liked the best whenever it was paired up with another cover option. So it's exciting. It's a new cover art. It's new intro. It's a new description. And there's a couple of other changes we're going to make to the format of the podcast. Nothing major. Don't freak out just yet. But I've always said that I wanted this to feel like it's more interactive isn't the right word, but more personalized to you, the listener. And so what I want to do, and I've gone back and I've looked at statistics and I've looked at all of the data as far as what type of episodes get the best downloads and which ones get the best response on social media. And what I have found is that shorter, more information-packed episodes really do have the most impact and have the most downloads and have the most positive response. So the majority of the episodes going forward will be solo, just me giving you kind of advice or tips or inspiration or sharing a resource or whatever the topic is. They're going to be shorter, so less than 30 minutes, probably closer to 20 to 25 minutes. Some may even be just quick 10-minute episodes, depending on the topic. But I know that you're busy. You are doing all the things. You are a mom, a business owner. You've got other things going on. Maybe you work a full-time job. And so a lot of times you only have a short window of time to consume content. And while I personally love longer form content and I listen to a lot of longer form podcasts, I don't always have time for those. And when I have just a quick 20 or 30 minute drive somewhere, or I'm sitting in car line waiting for my kids to get out of school, I don't have time to listen to a 2-hour podcast, but I do have time to squeeze in a 20-minute episode that's going to give me value or give me something to help me feel like I am improving myself, my business, my life, whatever it might be. So that is one change that we're going to make, is that the episodes are going to be a little bit more concentrated, I guess might be a good word, giving you just the important stuff and not a lot of fluff. So I'm not going to, and I've never really done this, but I'm not going to come in and talk for 10 minutes about my life and what's been going on in my life other than this episode. But I'm just going to kind of come in and get straight to the point and give you what you need in order to get your business growing. I will still have expert interview episodes, but I'm going to be very selective in who I bring into those episodes, because I want to make sure that, again, if you are devoting an hour of your day to listening to an expert that I have brought onto the show, I want to make sure that it's somebody that is really going to add value to your life and your business. And so I'm not going to bring people in that are just promoting something that they are selling or offering. I'm going to bring in people who I truly can learn from and that I know that you will learn from as well. So those will be sprinkled in amongst the other regular sessions. The last thing that's going to change about the podcast is I do want to make this a little more interactive, but that requires work on your part. I need some feedback. I need some user interaction. So I'm going to be sharing, especially on my Instagram stories, I'm going to be putting up a lot of prompts, asking you for questions, asking you for messages, because what I would love to do is have you, the listener, send me your questions, send me your problems, your conflicts, things going on in your business. Maybe it's a client dilemma and you want advice on how to solve that problem. And I can use that to either create an episode or fit it into an episode. At the end of the episode, I can read off a listener question and answer that question. And so I would love, love, love for you to head over to my Instagram at Girl Means Business, send me a DM, or if you see a story prompt where I'm asking a question for the podcast, drop me a message or respond to that question sticker and let me know what you want to hear, what questions you have. If there's a guest that you're like, oh my gosh, I heard this person on their podcast, I think you would love this person, send me their name, because I'm going to be relying a lot on you as my friend, as my listener, as my audience, to let me know what you want out of this podcast. I do not want this to become me talking at you all the time. I want this to become me talking with you. And the best way to do that is for you to tell me what it is that you want to learn about or hear. Maybe you heard another topic on another podcast. You were like, I would love to hear Kendra's take on this. Or I would love to go a little deeper into this. They really just scratched the surface. send that to me. Let me know. I promise you are not bothering me. You are not bugging me. It will make my day to get that message from you in my DMs. The other way you can help me is by sharing the podcast. So take a screenshot of this episode, share it to your Instagram stories, your Facebook stories, tell people that you're excited that it's back and that you're listening. Because the more people we can get listening to the episodes and sending feedback and asking questions and giving suggestions, the more tailored this podcast is going to become. And so not only does it help me as far as like downloads and all those things, which honestly don't matter a ton to me, they're just numbers. But the more people that I can get this podcast in front of and the more people that this podcast can reach and help, the more impact it's going to have. And that is the metric of results that I want to measure. So it would be a huge ask and a huge gift if you could share this podcast with other people, with other female business owners, and let them know that this is something that they might find value in as well. Okay, so now I want to give a little bit of insight into what has been going on in my life and business over the last couple of months. So I took a break from the podcast. I think it was mid-September, maybe early October. I really don't think it's been that long. I'm trying to go back and look and see like when the last episode actually aired. Okay, here it is. It was actually August 9th. So it's been a hot minute since I took a break from the podcast. And there's a couple of reasons. If you go back and listen to the previous episode, then you'll hear kind of the reasons why I was starting to feel burned out and what led me to deciding to take a break. And ultimately, I felt deep down in my heart, like this is not the end of the podcast. It could be if I take a break and it's just the greatest thing ever, it could be. But I genuinely felt like it was not the end. And obviously it's not because I'm back. But at the time, I was starting to feel those signs of burnout and those signs of I need to step back from this in order to really evaluate my feelings on this in my business, what it's doing to serve my business versus the time it's taking up in my business. And what I didn't know at the time was that there was going to be some things happening in my life that would really lend itself to taking a break from the podcast. So I'm going to back up a little bit. In August, I decided to take a break from the podcast. And late August, so August 9th, obviously was my last episode, as we mentioned earlier. About a week or so after that, I launched a new product, a new service in my business called the Focus Photographer Lab. It's a coaching membership for photographers. It is something that I have been thinking about and kind of planning and brainstorming on for about a year and a half. And I was so excited to finally launch this membership. And so I was like, okay, this is perfect timing. I'm taking a break from the podcast. I will have time to devote to this membership, to this new endeavor. I launched it. It went really well. I got people into the membership. Things was going great. Then come mid-September, and there's no better way to put it. Basically, the shit hit the fan, personally. Professionally, everything in my business was going great. But there was sort of this chain reaction of events that caused me to have an entire month from like mid-September to mid-October where I just sort of lost a month of my life. It started sadly with the passing of our dog Leia, our German Shepherd pup. She very suddenly and sadly passed away. We had to break it to our kids who were devastated. It was their first experience of losing a pet. It really hit me pretty hard too. Like we don't realize how much our pets are a part of our lives until they're taken from us. And then I left after that happened. About a couple days later, I had already had a trip planned for a girls' trip. Went on this girls' trip to the mountains. We did a bunch of hiking, went to a concert, and I ended up getting a little bit of altitude sickness, came home, turned into a much larger sickness that knocked me out for about a week and a half. And I'm not someone who really typically does get sick, much less like allow the sickness to stop me from living my life. This one completely knocked me on my rear end. And so that took me out for about 10 days, then started feeling better, immediately got a stomach bug, which took me out for about 3 days. So it was just this like chain of like a thing after a thing after a thing. And the nice thing about it was that I was in a position with the podcast, because this podcast is not a huge part of the, like a time suck on my business, but it is something that takes a lot of energy and planning, and then the recording and all those things. And so it was nice to know that like didn't have to worry about that. Like I didn't have to have episodes recorded because I didn't have a voice for a couple of days. I had like a sore throat and I was scratchy and I couldn't really talk. I was nauseous, all the things. So having that off my plate really was a blessing in disguise, because there's a pressure I put on myself to make sure I have these episodes every single week. I had this idea in my head of like, I have not missed a week since starting the podcast 4.5 years ago. Every week for 4.5 years, I had published an episode. And I knew, looking back, if I had been sick, or if I had had the month that I had where I didn't get anything done in my business and I had missed putting out episodes, I would have felt completely guilty, and I would have put a lot of pressure on myself to show up when really my body was telling me to take a break and take care of myself. So looking back, it's been a blessing. However, they say that there are like these stages that you go through when it comes to grief or when a loss. I feel like I went through those phases with this podcast and putting this podcast on hold. So it started with kind of this idea of like acceptance and excitement, which probably not the same as what you have when you're experiencing grief or loss. But for me, stage 1 was this kind of relief feeling. Like I mentioned before, it's one thing off my plate, but it already felt extremely full. And it was this sort of like feeling of, okay, now I can focus on these other things and not feel like I'm spread so thin in my business. So stage 1 was kind of this idea of relief and like, whew, that's one less thing. And then it moved into stage 2, which is, okay, now what am I going to do with this extra time? What am I going to do with this extra energy that I have that I'm not putting towards this podcast? So I started a YouTube channel, which one of the changes going forward is this will be also a video podcast. So this episode will not be a video episode, but going forward, all episodes or majority of episodes will be videoed and also put onto YouTube. So if you're someone who prefers a video format, those will be on my YouTube channel going forward. I also kind of started dabbling more in Pinterest, and I was updating my website, and I was working on the coaching membership and just all these other little things. And then I went through stage 3, which was a little bit of FOMO, which is funny to say, but yes, I am an Enneagram 7. I have lots of FOMO. And I would find myself listening to other people's podcasts and getting a little bit jealous, being like, oh, I miss my podcast. I miss being able to say that I have a podcast. I miss the messages and the DMs and the emails I would get after launching an episode, and I would get to hear from the listeners and get feedback, or somebody would comment on my post on Instagram and be like, oh, I can't wait to listen, or I loved this episode. And I was still getting downloads, and people were listening to the podcast, and people were listening to other episodes of podcasts I'd been interviewed on. So I was still getting traffic that way, but it wasn't quite the same. So I had a little bit of this like, oh, like I feel like I'm missing out on this. And then the final stage for me was someone asked me like, oh, do you miss having your podcast? And had they asked me 6 weeks prior to this, I would have been like, oh no, it's been great. Like I don't miss it at all. But at that moment, I had like this, like the metaphorical like light bulb that comes on that happens in cartoons and movies. It was that light bulb moment. I was like, yeah, I really do miss the podcast. And like, why am I not doing it again? And so I took some time and I really looked into and thought about and journaled and made notes and brainstormed ideas of like, what do I want the podcast to look like coming back? How do I want it to change? Do I want it to change? And ultimately, I decided that I missed it, and I missed you guys. Like I said at the beginning of the show, I genuinely miss what this podcast has been for me, but I also miss what it's been for you as the listener. And so I want to say to you, the listener, thank you so much for coming along with me on this journey, for coming back to the podcast. If you were here before and you've come back after this break, if you're brand new, welcome. This episode has probably been this is the most rambly personal episode I've ever recorded on the show, probably. I promise you this is not how all the episodes will go going forward. So just bear with me on this one. But if you've hung on this long, thank you so much for being here. I am so excited for what's to come for this episode. It's a new spark of excitement, and that's what I was missing before that I have found again. So I feel like it's going to be a spark that really turns into a flame that gets this podcast going in a direction that it probably would not have gone in had I continued going whenever I was starting to feel those signs of burnout. So wherever you are at, thank you so much for being here and for listening. And next week, I promise we're going to dive into some business content to get you going as we go into the holiday season and the new year. Lots and lots of stuff coming forward for you to learn and soak up. So thank you again for being here, and I will see you back here next week. Thanks again for tuning into this week's episode. Don't forget to leave a review and follow us on socials at Girl Means Business. See you next week.